So when we think of the capital markets, we've seen significant uptick in the last few years with the economic recovery and the bounce back. But from where you stand, you see a lot of markets. How do you evaluate where Sri Lanka's capital markets are relative to maybe other frontier and emerging market countries?
Given how Sri Lanka has recovered and the good job the policymakers have done and the corporates as well in their recovery, I think Sri Lanka really stands out amongst the frontier markets that I cover. So I'm very bullish long term on Sri Lanka, among my top country picks going forward as well.
What really stands out, or what are some of the things that you would like to see in terms of the reform side?
But I think one thing which investors will watch out for, so 2025 is only the first year of a proper normalized economic recovery for Sri Lanka post elections and post all the crisis, right? So I think if investors see that Sri Lanka can sustain macro stability and political stability for a long term, next 3 to 5 years, then you'll see them come back to the market. You'll have more confidence from investors to invest in Sri Lanka.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this brand new episode on Front Row here on Economy.lk. I'm today in conversation with Ruchir Desai of Asia Frontier Capital. He's a co fund manager based out in Hong Kong. Ruchir, pleasure to have you
Thank you
on
for
the
having me.
show.
Good to be back in Colombo.
So, when we think of the capital markets, we've seen significant uptick in the last few years with the economic recovery and the bounce back. But from where you stand, you see a lot of markets. How do you evaluate where Sri Lanka's capital markets are relative to maybe other frontier and emerging market countries?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question to start off. So I think you got to put this market performance in Colombo and Sri Lanka over the last probably 2.5 years in context to where Sri Lanka was. So if you look at the period between 2018 2023, it was not a easiest of times for Sri Lanka from a macro perspective or from a political perspective. So you had one crisis or one kind of issue after the other. In 2008, end of 2018, you had the constitutional crisis. In 2019, you had the Easter Sunday attacks. Then you had the pandemic for 2 years, 2020 and 21. Then you had the political crisis, etc. So obviously, it was one setback after the other, which led to a lot of confidence ebbing from investors, both locally, foreign and foreigners, and also, I guess, domestic from the corporates as well, right? That led to very attractive valuations at some point in time. So I remember when I was here in November 2022, just after the crisis, I was on the ground in Colombo. I was here for almost a week. The entire P/E ratio for the stock market was 4 times. So it just showed you the kind of value that was available in the market. And at that point in time, you have to take a call on whether the country can recover from some of the mistakes it's made from a policy perspective, it's from a macro perspective. And we saw that happening from 2023, right? So you saw the IMF program in place, interest rates coming down, inflation peaking out, and you had the elections last year as well. And that's led to a recovery in general, not just in the market, but also because the economic growth has come back in a strong way. Earnings have come back. So to answer your question, given how Sri Lanka has recovered and the good job the policymakers have done and the corporates as well in their recovery, I think Sri Lanka really stands out amongst the frontier markets that I cover. So I'm very bullish long term on Sri Lanka, and it's among my top country picks going forward as well.
You just mentioned you're quite bullish, and I think you've been very positive on Sri Lanka for quite a while. What really stands out, or what are some of the things that you would like to see in terms of the reform side that for the government to implement so that other funds will get excited about us? Because we're not the only investment market or destination. There are others that also have a story to tell, an investment thesis to sell, and so on. What would make Sri Lanka attractive?
So I think reforms, which everyone talks about, is very broad based, right? So reforms don't happen overnight. Doesn't happen in 1 month or 1 quarter or 1 year. It's a more long term process which the government needs to execute on. So obviously, given where the country was in 2022, 23, there have been, you can tick a lot of boxes. The debt restructuring was completed successfully, both domestic debt and international debt. Central bank law was passed. So obviously, the government is moving in the right direction. So it's step by step process that happens. But I think one thing which investors will watch out for. So 2025 is only the first year of a proper normalized economic recovery for Sri Lanka post elections and post all the crisis, right? So I think if investors see that Sri Lanka can sustain macro stability and political stability for a long term, next 3 to 5 years, then you'll see them come back to the market, and you'll have more confidence from investors to invest in Sri Lanka. So I think that's what they're looking for. No one's looking for 7% growth, 8% growth on a regular basis. In my mind, even if you do 4 to 5% GDP growth
Mm.
with political and macro stability, I think there's a huge room for many of the stocks and for the market to create even further from here.
Right. And I think we've seen at least this year some level of foreign outflows coming, taking place, potentially maybe macro re-ratings or things like that. What would you think convince some of the funds or some of the portfolio investors sitting outside to put some money back into, or allocate some money back into Sri Lankan equities? And would a like a rating upgrade potentially maybe after the Sri Lankan Airlines restructuring is complete? Would that be the catalyst, or is there something else that we're missing out on?
Yeah, so one is the rating upgrades coming through, which will obviously give more confidence to investors to look at Sri Lanka again and allocate some capital to Sri Lanka. But I think it's the continuation of the macro stability, like I mentioned, not having any hiccups, structurally or from a political or from a policy perspective, which we've seen before, right? So investors, if you go back 2014, 2015, 2016, there were quite a few foreign investors in Sri Lanka. The P ratio for the whole market was, I think, 15 times. And you're still at a discount compared to where you were pre-crisis. But if you look at the performance of many of the listed companies, the return on equity, their earnings is all back to pre-crisis levels. So I think incrementally, if there's no major hiccup from a policy perspective or macro perspective, I think you will see the foreigners coming back. And coming to your question about foreign outflows, it's not a Sri Lanka only issue. Vietnam, which is a darling of foreign investors, everyone loves talking about Vietnam, how it's benefiting from supply chain relocation from mainland China or from China into Vietnam. They're exporting a lot to the US. But there have been massive foreign outflows even this year. So I think it just comes down to how the foreign funds or emerging market funds are allocating capital, which markets they're looking at. But I would expect foreigners to come back if you have maybe 2026 a stable year with no major issues. And then I think you'll see foreigners come back to Sri Lanka in
Sure,
2026.
sure. We're recording, I think, at the time of, with the disaster, the cyclone, and reeling from the impacts, initially assessments being done. But what sectors do you feel in 2026 are exciting or could drive that growth at a GDP economic growth level, but also provide that earnings or that valuation from an investment point of view?
Sure. So I think given that there's been broad-based economic growth until maybe a couple of days ago, across the board, you're seeing growth in consumer, in leisure and construction, etc. I think banks are a very good way to play the GDP or economic recovery story in Sri Lanka, or in general, sustaining economic growth in Sri Lanka, because the banks are leveraged to many of these sectors. Could be leisure, could be construction, could be working capital loans, consumer loans, etc. But more than that, the valuations for the banks are still very attractive. So if you look at some of the top two, three private commercial banks in Sri Lanka, they've seen their stock price rally a lot over the last 2.5 years, but the valuations are still very attractive. So, for example, some of the well-known banks are trading at less than one times price to book, some just slightly above one. And like I mentioned, the return on equity, the fundamentals are back to pre-crisis levels. So there's nothing to stop them from, or nothing to stop the valuations from re further from here. So for 2026, my top sector pick would be banks. And I think consumption, which was so subdued in Sri Lanka for many years, because of the pandemic, because of the political crisis, because of high inflation, you're seeing that come back now only for the last probably 6 months. So I think 2026, 27 consumption stocks or consumer stocks, people going back to well-known brands or because they higher disposable income, they should benefit. So I would say banks and consumer are two sectors to watch out for, not just for 26, but I would say over the next 2 to 3 years.
Are you bullish on other sectors like tourism, other
Yeah, but
maybe
the
hospitality?
unfortunate part is for tourism, there's not many ways to play the list in the listed space. So yes, it's very exciting. Tourism numbers are very strong this year. You'll be doing all-time high tourist arrivals. I think 2.3 odd million tourists in 2025. So if you're around Sri Lanka, I think you see a lot of tourists. So it's very good for the macro from a foreign exchange reserve perspective. It has a trickle down effect on other parts of the economy as well. But unfortunately, that's something maybe the companies could look at. I mean, there are quite a few leisure companies listed in the market, not very liquid. So that's something maybe the regulator can look at, or the companies themselves can look at to make their names more liquid for foreigners to play. So yeah, because if you look at say Thailand or even Vietnam, there are a few tourism names which are doing quite well, which are quite liquid, quite accessible for investors. So yeah, for the sector, I'm positive, but just as an investor, there's not a very liquid way to play play that story.
Sure. Thanks, Ruchir, for joining us this conversation. I think it was useful to get a foreign investment fund view on Sri Lanka at a macro level, some of the key drivers, and then really in some of the counters and the sector perspectives, and a lot to look forward to, I think, as 2016 unfolds as well. Thank you for joining this
Thank you for
conversation.
having me. And yeah, I think 2026 is going to be another good year for Sri Lanka from a macro perspective. I think from a stock market perspective as well. So I think we just mean as long as the stability sustains from a macro and political perspective, I think the market should do well.
Thank you. There you heard it on front row, and thank you for tuning in. And we look forward to more insightful episodes like this.